Chapter 11. Spinelli parked his truck in the only vacant stall in the parking lot of Shannon's apartment complex. He cut the engine and glanced about the area surrounding the two-story brick building. When he deemed it safe, he turned his attention to Shannon, who sat silently in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield. "Shannon?" Spinelli whispered. The second he said her name, her body flinched and she gasped for air. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, but you're home." "It's okay. Thanks for the ride," she replied as she nervously reached for the door handle. Spinelli flung his door open and slid out of the truck. He raced to the other side of the vehicle and reached Shannon's side just as she shut the passenger door. "I'll walk you to your door." "Thank you, but you don't need to. I'll be fine," she ensured. Spinelli simply ignored her and continued to walk with her. When they reached the front door, Shannon ran her fingers over the numeric touchpad and the door unlocked. He followed her through the doorway and the common area, which housed a wall of mailboxes. He continued to follow her as she turned left in the long, narrow corridor. She paused and looked back at him. "I'm fine. You don't need to bother yourself any longer. I think I can manage from here." He strapped on his ladykiller grin. "It's no bother." He continued to follow her to her apartment door. Shannon fumbled with her key. Her nervous hands struggled even more as she tried to insert the key into the slot. Spinelli reached over and took the key from her hand. "I'll get that for you." The soft, quick brush of her hand against his caused the blood in his veins to heat up just short of boiling. Spinelli turned toward the sound of a door opening behind him to find a little old lady standing in the doorway of the apartment directly across the hall from Shannon's. "Is that you, dear?" the woman asked. Shannon spun around to face the woman. "Yes, Mrs. Finch, it's me. We didn't wake you, did we?" "Oh, no, dear. Me and Sister are just watching the news. Well, Sister's watching and I'm listening. I heard you come home, so I thought I'd just give you my grocery list tonight and see how your day was at the mall. Were there lots of children visiting Santa today?" Spinelli watched Shannon smile as she spoke with Mrs. Finch. "Yes, the mall was packed and the line of children was endless for a while." Mrs. Finch smiled. "Oh, what fun. I love this time of year." The conversation paused, and Spinelli continued to look at Mrs. Finch as she stood in the doorway in her pink bathrobe belted at the waist. Small black curlers held her steel-gray hair in place. Mrs. Finch's eyes widened, and her face lit up as if someone turned a light bulb on within her. She stepped out of the doorway and into the hall, and turned her head from Shannon to Spinelli. "Did you say we, dear?" Before Shannon could reply, Mrs. Finch turned her head back in the direction of her apartment and yelled with her fragile voice, "Sister, come quick! Shannon's got company and he smells like a hot one." Spinelli couldn't help but smile at Mrs. Finch's comment, and when he flashed his eyes in Shannon's direction, he caught her eye roll. The shuffle of his feet drew his attention back toward Mrs. Finch's apartment door. Another little old lady surfaced in the doorway. Not only did she look just like the first little old lady, she dressed the same as well. The second little old lady flashed a smile in his direction, and then looked at Shannon. "Who's your friend, dear?" Shannon gestured toward Mrs. Finch and her sister and looked at Spinelli. "Nick Spinelli, these are my neighbors, Sally Finch and Sarah Knight. Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Knight, this is Nick Spinelli." Mrs. Finch reached toward Spinelli, and he took her small, cold, bony, shriveled hand in his. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Finch." Mrs. Finch's smile grew, nearly stretching from ear to ear. She let out a giggle and turned her head toward her sister. "Large, warm hands. Smells good. Does he look as hot as he feels and smells?" she asked in a stage whisper. Mrs. Knight flashed a wink in Spinelli's direction, smiled, leaned toward her sister, and whispered, "Oh, he's a looker, all right. Tall, dark, and handsome. Mysterious eyes, the kind a woman can get lost in. Looks to be pretty fit, too, sister. Too bad you can't see this one. He's a delight." Spinelli kept most of his attention focused on the sisters, but he took a glance at Shannon out of the corner of his eye. A bright shade of red began consuming her pale-colored skin, rising upward from her neck. "Come on, sister. Let's leave these kids alone to go about their business." "We don't have any business," Shannon immediately piped up. "I mean, Mr. Spinelli just gave me a ride home from work. We're not really—" Mrs. Finch interrupted Shannon mid-sentence. "Shannon, dear, why don't you share some of those delicious gingerbread cookies you baked with your friend? She's an excellent baker, Mr. Spinelli." He couldn't help himself.
"I'd love to try them. Gingerbread cookies are my favorite."
Spinelli wished the ladies a good night and turned to follow Shannon into her apartment. "What do you think you're doing?" Shannon asked him.
"I'm getting my cookies."
He reached for the door behind him and heard the sisters whispering, "It's about time that sweet girl gets a man in her life." "You're right, sister. Her clock is ticking. Poor thing." The door clicked shut. Spinelli stifled his chuckle and pressed on about the cookies. Shannon rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Fine. I'll give you some cookies, and that's all you're getting. Then will you please just leave?" she asked as she spun on her heel and headed toward the kitchen, shedding her coat along the way. Spinelli easily sensed her discomfort, and he blamed it on her unwanted attraction to him. He couldn't help but want to add to her discomfort, tease her just a bit.
"Are you normally this rude to all the guests you invite in for cookies?"
Shannon turned to face Spinelli. She flashed him a scowl and took a moment to conjure up her response. "Excuse me, but I don't recall inviting you in for cookies. What I recall is you rudely inviting yourself in for cookies." Spinelli fought to keep from smiling. He liked the way she tried to cover her nervousness as she spoke to him. The conscious attempt made her voice deeper and even sexier than normal. With a voice like that, he thought for sure she could double as a 1-900 operator. Shannon quickly turned again and headed in the direction of the kitchen. Spinelli followed with his eyes fixed on her backside. She probably had no clue how sexy she looked in her skimpy Santa helper outfit. Didn't notice the elves ogling her all night either. The thought of it stirred the jealous juices inside him. Spinelli shrugged off his coat and flung it over the back of one of the 2 counter-height stools situated at the kitchen island. He pulled the stool out and took a seat. He figured he could get away with making himself comfortable and staying for a while because he knew she would want to prove him wrong about her being rude. And he knew she wouldn't be able to live with herself if someone thought of her as being rude. Shannon turned to face him, a clear plastic bag full of cookies gripped in her fist. She reached over the counter and handed them to him. He took them from her and set them on the counter. He undid the twist tie and pulled one from the bag. "What are you doing?" she asked. Spinelli shifted his eyes from his bag of cookies and looked up at her.
"I'm eating my cookies."
She narrowed her gaze but said nothing. From the look on her face, he knew he had her. She was just too nice to kick him out, and most important, he knew that deep down she felt an attraction to him. He knew she didn't want it to be so, but she was. After a brief moment of silence, Shannon slipped into the mode Spinelli knew she would. "Would you like some milk with your cookies?" Spinelli smiled.
"Yes, please."
Shannon turned toward the refrigerator and opened it. She bent over, reached into the fridge to grab the jug of milk from the bottom shelf, exposing more of her shapely legs. Excitement penetrated through Spinelli's body, nearly caused him to choke.
God, she doesn't have a clue.
She shut the refrigerator door and then reached up into the cupboard to retrieve 2 glasses, again causing her little dress to rise. She poured a glass of milk for Spinelli and one for herself. Then she took a seat alongside him and grabbed a cookie. Spinelli took a swig of his milk to chase down the cookie, and then set the glass back on the countertop. He shifted his stool a bit in order to face Shannon.
What do you know about this card game? Did Hudson and Reed play?
Shannon set the remainder of her cookie down on her plate and took a drink of her milk. She ran her tongue across her lips, clearing away the remaining cookie crumbs and milk from them. The maneuver sent Spinelli's heart into overdrive. He willed her to do it again, only this time he imagined himself capturing her tongue with his mouth. He imagined his tongue in a long, slow dance with hers. She answered his question, interrupting his fantasy. I don't really know anything about the game. I've heard the college kids, the elves and the security guards, talk about how they play cards in the Greek restaurant after the mall closes. I think they play poker. I would imagine that Aaron Reed played, but I don't think Roland Hudson played.
Do they play every night? And do they play for money?
Shannon thought for a moment. I'm not sure if they play every night. I only work on the weekends, and I know they play on the weekends, and I definitely know they play for money. I've heard some of the elves talk about how they need to work for Lucas at times to pay off their debt. So here they are trying to earn extra cash for school, and they need to work off their gambling debts.
Do you know what they do to work off their gambling debts?
Shannon responded with a slight shrug. I just assumed they worked in the restaurant or something. I never really thought about it. Spinelli finished his cookies and downed the last of his milk. He'd hoped it would take longer so he could spend more time with Shannon, but the cookies were so good he just couldn't help but gobble them up. Like he wanted to gobble her up, but knew she wasn't ready for that yet. He figured her for the kind of woman that planned out every move in her life. She would take her time when it came to letting a man into it. As much as he wanted her right now, he didn't mind the wait. She would be worth it. He slid his stool back from the counter and stood. He pulled his coat from the back of the stool and flung it over his shoulders.
Well, it's getting late. Are you working at the mall tomorrow?
He asked, knowing the answer because he'd already checked the work schedule, which hung in the employee break room. Yes, I work from 5 to 9, she replied, as she rose from her stool and stood in front of Spinelli, staring up at him with her big green eyes.
So I'll pick you up at about 4:30 then,
he asked, hoping not to get any grief from her. Not only did he just desire to be with her, he also wanted to keep an eye on her. He didn't know what was going on yet or why Hudson and Reed were both murdered at the mall, and he feared for her safety. Spinelli kept his eyes fixed on hers as she appeared to debate her answer to his question. She blinked flirtatiously as a soft smile drew across her face. So you're going to stick the Santa thing out at least another day? Spinelli returned her smile.
What are you saying? You don't think I make a good Santa?
Shannon's soft, sweet chuckle rang through his ears. Oh, you're a natural, all right. I don't recall ever seeing a man look so horrified at the sight of children. Her chuckle turned to full-blown laughter. And when that little girl had an accident on your lap, you looked like you were going to die right there on the spot. Spinelli laughed deeply. He knew she was right. He had very little experience with children.
Hopefully the dry cleaners can do a rush job on my uniform tomorrow morning.
Shannon smiled. I'm sure they'll give a little extra effort for Santa. Shannon saw Spinelli to the door. He stepped through the doorway and turned toward her, his eyes fixed on hers.
I'll pick you up at 4:30 tomorrow.
Okay. Good night.